Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight as the Center for Catholic Studies hosts Professor Jeremy Wilkins of Boston College for a guest lecture and discussion on the topic, Politics and the Cross, Friendship and Responsibility in an Age of Dysfunction. Welcome, Professor Wilkins. The timeliness of this topic does not require further explanation. Discord in our nation and the world is loud and deep. And through our discussion tonight, we aim to address questions such as how to approach civic responsibility at a time of cultural conflict, declining trust, and political dysfunction, and how our faith can possibly guide us and the higher viewpoint. This event is sponsored by the Bernard J. Lonergan Institute and co-sponsored by the Department of Religion, the University Corps, Campus Ministry, and the Program in Catholic Studies. For over 20 years, the Center for Catholic Studies has been dedicated to fostering an ongoing dialogue between the Catholic intellectual tradition and all areas of study and contemporary culture in the spirit of the Catholic Church's legacy of bringing forth things new and old. The Center's 3 institutes, scholarly research, publications, and programming serve to generate new initiatives and facilitate conversation and collaboration among faculty, administrators, students, and the general public. In 2006, the Center for Catholic Studies launched the Bernard J. Lonergan Institute under the founding directorship of Monsignor Richard Liddy, dedicated to the study of Lonergan's ideas and their application in contemporary culture. Bernard Lonergan was a 20th century Catholic philosopher and theologian whom Newsweek cited as among the finest philosophical thinkers of the 20th century. The Institute contains all of Lonergan's published works, copies of his most significant unpublished writings, doctoral dissertations on Lonergan's work, the most significant secondary literature on Lonergan, and Lonergan's memorabilia. In addition to ongoing research and scholarship, the Institute focuses on faculty development and sponsors graduate study, faculty and student reading groups, ongoing programs, and the publication of the acclaimed journal, the Lonergan Review. This lecture is the annual fall lecture sponsored by the Bernard Lonergan Institute. In 2020, the leadership of the center, including the Bernard Lonergan Institute, was passed from its founding director, the University Professor of Catholic Thought and Culture, Monsignor Richard Liddy, to Dr. Gregory Floyd. Dr. Gregory Floyd is B.A. Notre Dame, M.A. and Ph.D. Boston College. At Seton Hall University, he is also a teaching fellow in the core curriculum. Dr. Floyd specializes in 19th and 20th century European philosophy. His scholarship focuses on the history and methodology of phenomenology and hermeneutics, as well as the philosophy of religion. His areas of teaching and scholarship include the history of philosophy, philosophy and literature, and the thought of Bernard Lonergan. And now to introduce our distinguished speaker, Jeremy Wilkins. Please welcome the new director of the Center for Catholic Studies and the Bernard Lonergan Institute, Dr. Gregory Floyd.
Gregory, you're muted.
I said I wasn't going to do that, mute myself. So let me say it again. Welcome, faculty, administrators, students, friends of the Center for Catholic Studies. I am Gregory Floyd, the director here, professor of philosophy in our core program. And while we would normally be doing this in person, and it's regrettable that we can't, I'm very glad there's some form available to us to gather together and think and dialogue and discuss with one another. And I was thinking as we were preparing for tonight, in a way, this sort of virtual reality we're living in is not unlike that faced by many people prior to the technological revolution. Erasmus spoke about a republic of letters, and granted, they were speaking about actually writing letters and not virtual events and platforms and emails and Zooms and Microsoft Teams and all these sorts of things. But the thought was friends far and wide could still gather together in some sort of virtual space, a pale imitation, but still a worthwhile imitation of real physical proximity, to discuss things that matter, matters of substance. And so my hope tonight, my hope this whole year, it looks like, is that conversation and friendship can unite us even at a distance in heart and mind when we can't be together physically and enjoying various conversations and libations in another form. As Danute said, our topic this evening is certainly a timely one, and I won't belabor the point, but November 3rd is only a few weeks away. And we engage in this conversation with Jeremy, a conversation about conversation, at a time of unparalleled partisanship and the breakdown of our civic conversation and the bonds of civic friendship that are the presupposition of any democracy, and certainly of our own. So two questions confront us tonight as people affiliated in some way with a university, and many of us also as people of faith. First, what is offered for our reflection as men and women and people committed to truth and to friendship in some way? And secondly, that same question revisits us as from the perspective of faith. How might we as people of confessing faith transcend, as our faith calls us to, the parties and the platforms and the partisanship of any particular moment in time, including our own moment in time, and engage in some fruitful form of civic life together? What are the insights, as Lonergan might say, that await us on the other side of our preferences and our predispositions and indeed our biases? Our Lonergan lecture each semester is a great way to gather to talk about topics timely and untimely. And it's dedicated to the memory, of course, of Father Bernard Lonergan, a Catholic priest and philosopher and theologian, who, in my own summary, has advocated tirelessly for the idea that understanding oneself was the key to understanding everything else. And our unofficial motto here, taken from an essay much beloved by Lonergan's students, is that the goal here is to expand the not numerous center. Those of us passionate enough about truth and loving enough of our neighbor to engage in conversation and debate. We are thrilled this evening to have a guide for that dialogue, Dr. Jeremy Wilkins from Boston College, professor of systematic and historical theology, to lead us into these conversations. Jeremy, Dr. Wilkins, has a recent book out that I've had the privilege of spending a number of mornings with over the last few weeks called Before Truth, Lonergan, Aquinas, and the Problem of Wisdom. That takes up this very theme in a different mode to ask, how do we become people capable of wisdom and learn to be wise ourselves? Two other recent publications of his that I think speak very directly to the conversation we want to facilitate this evening. And to my students in the audience, I did not plan this. We did not know Jeremy was coming when I planned a class on friendship. But the first is titled The Fragility of Conversation, Consciousness and Self-Understanding in Postmodern Culture. And the second is titled Grace and Friendship, the title of a volume of essays he curated with a professor you met a few weeks ago, Dr. Sean Copeland. Before I turn it over to Jeremy, I'd like to just point out that in the upper right-hand corner of your, hopefully, of your browser are two conversation bubbles that have a question mark in them. We're going to use these to facilitate the Q&A. So over the course of Jeremy's talk, Dr. Wilkins' talk, please drop, as the youths say, drop a question into the chat. Let us know what you're thinking, what strikes you, what you agree with, what you don't agree with, what you'd like to hear him elaborate further. And then on the back end, we'll be able to receive all of those and curate them in a Q&A that will follow his talk. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Jeremy Wilkins, my friend. Here we go.
Thanks very much, Greg. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. And Professor Floyd and I have known each other for a long time. And so I was really delighted to get an invitation to do this. It's a pleasure. It's an honor to speak with you all tonight. I should be remiss if I don't remember to thank, besides Greg Floyd, also Danute Norse and Ashley Banks, their graduate assistant, and Burke Loxley, who spent half an hour with me this afternoon teaching me how to do Teams, and Michael Supios, who's quietly monitoring the whole proceeding to make sure I don't go off the rails, at least in a technological manner. I may go off the rails in some other manner. When we scheduled this event many months ago, we had no idea we would be competing for your attention with a presidential debate. I don't know if the president got word of the head-to-head, but I'm grateful that he nixed that event so you could be here tonight with a clean conscience. The topic I propose to address is politics and the cross, friendship and responsibility in an age of dysfunction. Are my slides now showing, or am I showing?
Your slides are showing.
They are, okay, thank you, sorry. I'm going to, politics and the cross, friendship and responsibility in an age of dysfunction. Though my description of the age of dysfunction may seem endless, I assure you we will eventually get to responsibility, friendship, and even the cross. And who doesn't want to end on the cross? A democracy such as ours is an experiment in collective responsibility. It is an uncertain experiment, but one to which I feel we as Christians ought to be committed. It is deeply consonant, I feel, with our vision of human subjects as entrusted to their own dominion, their own self-government by God our Creator. But that is an argument for another time. A democracy worthy of the name presupposes a functioning civil conversation. Conversation is a difficult activity. It can occur in a genuine way only if the persons involved are sincerely invested in understanding one another and not just scoring points. It moves forward by persuasion, which is genuine when it occurs by giving reasons, and counterfeit when it is blowing smoke or intimidating by heat, not light. The alternative to civil conversation is a civil war of words, or worse. St. Augustine defined peace as tranquillitas ordinis, the tranquility of order. Things are at peace when they are properly related to one another. In heaven, God will be all in all, and peace will be perfect. But the imperfect peace possible to us in this life depends on a convergence of minds about what is to be loved. Absent that convergence, we have, Augustine says, not a commonweal, but a mob. Because human beings live under orders of their own choice and making, what individually and communally we love determines the kind of persons and community we are becoming. Thus, the human good of order depends on the quality of the subjects doing the loving, but that in turn depends a great deal on the quality of their culture, the common meanings and values they live by. There arises the problem of liberal education in the classic sense, the formative education of subjects capable of a good use of their liberty. The absence of order is confusion. And today we are confused. We are confused about ourselves and about each other as human beings and fellow citizens in a shared project. Instead of civil conversation, we have a civil war, carried on in words, but also by increasingly predatory uses of public power. It is widely felt that we are reaching or have already reached a civilizational crisis. And the result is widespread anxiety, a rage for order, and predictably a hunt for culprits. But because the crisis is not fully understood, it is laid at the feet of disparate causes. So the rage for order manifests itself quite differently in different quarters. Here, then, I propose to do 5 things. First, I describe the present confusion disturbing the tranquility of the American polity. Next, I hypothesize that an important source of civil confusion is that American civil discourse is generally conducted in 2 different moral languages. Neither of these is adequate to the reality of the human good, and their speakers are perhaps increasingly given to misunderstanding one another. Third, I propose some reasons why not only misunderstanding, but even outright hostility seems to be growing. Fourth, I suggest that if we Christians are to be of genuine service to our fellow citizens, we have to begin by emancipating ourselves from inadequate moral languages and renew our capacity to function in a more properly Christian language. And finally, I sketch some goals for a Christian participation in civil discourse. First, then, the section is called A Dialectic of Delegitimation. Our present confusion has many dimensions, but time bids us be brief, so I will risk a caricature by some general observations we won't have time to document or examine as they deserve. Legitimate rule is for the good of the common weal. It is motivated not by, It is motivated not by love for it is motivated by love for the whole, not by the lust for power. The ruler who does not take care of his people is not only faithless, but degenerate, Augustine says. But the question of legitimacy is quite complicated because both the ruler and the subjects can be quite confused or even unconcerned about what is the good of the whole. Hence, the perception of legitimacy can diverge from reality, especially perhaps when legitimacy is itself confused with mere legality, so that the true criterion of legitimacy, which is the good of the whole, is forgotten. Today we are in a crisis of legitimacy, for which my slide, however, has disappeared. But to different parts of the American polity, the crisis appears under disparate, indeed contrary lights. The result is a dialectic of delegitimation. The very policies that for one group are essential to redeem the American regime are for the other the very cause of its delegitimation, and vice versa. Let us attempt to sketch. First, then, a crisis is widely felt, but it's assigned to different causes. The different causes suggest opposed remedies. Everyone feels anxious, but their anxiety is associated with different objects. Anxiety evokes blame, and each part blames the other in some measure for causing or abetting decline and for thwarting its appropriate remedies. One part, then, is anxious about social inequity, climate change, and rule to the benefit of a dominant minority. This part feels, with considerable justice, that the regime never has been properly expressive of the authentic values or promise of America. The regime is historically and structurally delegitimized by its past and its ongoing oppressiveness, and by its present failures to address urgent problems as a result of its captivity to a dominant but culturally backward minority. In this view, the entrenched dominant minority is culpably blind to the inequities of its own position and determined to protect its unjust privilege. Its power to do so depends upon the inequitable institutions that are part of its historic legacy of structural injustice, particularly the Senate and the Electoral College. Inequitable by design, these institutions are also increasingly inequitable in fact because of proportional shifts in the size and the diversity of the American population. And they are delegitimated still further by their use to capture the judiciary, to block remedies, and to game the system to the advantage of the few. Things seem quite different, however, from an alternative vantage point. Thus, another part of the polity is anxious about the decay of personal and domestic virtue, economic decline, and the desertion of the regime's founding principles by its dominant elites. This part feels, with considerable justice, that it is despised by the cultural elites and deeply resents their condescension. It knows itself to be in serious trouble. It is losing ground economically and culturally, and it knows that its cultured despisers have been quite complicit in the erosion of its position. It perceives the cultured despisers as bent on destroying the American moral and cultural order, and even perhaps on replacing that order's authentic bearers, which this part understands itself to be, with others more biddable. In this perspective, then, the delegitimation of the regime is not historic and structural, but recent and adventitious. It results from the present capture of the administrative state and the judiciary by the cultured despisers, and the use of state power to unfairly target the majority, or at least the authentic representatives of the regime's founding values. Thus, when the historical legitimacy of the regime is assailed, this group hears not only a criticism of themselves, but also a cover story for their dispossession. The two parts are engaged in a civil war. It is a civil war of words and policies, but might easily become, at least in the more extreme quarters, a hot war of bloodshed. One part of the country cannot but perceive the election of Mr. Trump as an act of aggression against it, which, in a way, he certainly is. But on the other part, he is perceived as a bulwark against the aggression first perpetrated against it. Each part accuses the other of injustice to itself or to the good of the whole. The other has seceded from the commonweal or is destroying it. Each resents the other, suspects the other, denigrates the values of the other. Each regards the other as alienated. It is self-loathing and would destroy the genius of its own country, or it is blind to its own involvements in structural oppression and to the true causes of its displacement by the depredations of global capital. And while the perspective of each is or can be coherent on its own terms, neither is ready to grasp how the other could be reasonably affirmed on any terms. Hence, each perceives the struggle between right and wrong, good and evil, light and dark, as a conflict between us and them. Part 2, the moral dialects of individualism. Our civil conversation has become civil confusion because the two sides are talking past one another. They speak different moral languages, or perhaps better, different dialects of the same moral language of American individualism. And here I'm drawing on the work of my colleague, Frederick Lawrence, himself developing the analysis of Robert Bellah and his colleagues. By a moral language, I mean an acquired structure of thought and perception that conditions both what values one is likely or prepared to notice and how one is prepared to construe the values that are noticed. A moral language tells a story about the world and provides categories for the world's interpretation. In this sense, everyone operates with some kind of moral language, but for most people, the moral language is part of their common sense orientation to the world. It is unexamined and, in fact, cannot really be examined without moving beyond the practical orientation of common sense intelligence. The dominant dialects of American individualism are expressive and possessive. Each tells a different story of progress and its enemies. Each uses differently inflected language of rights and justice. Each supposes a notion of individual autonomy, but construes the meaning of autonomy differently. Each in some has its typical foci and corresponding oversights. Expressive individualism tells a story of progress toward full equality, but also of dark forces standing athwart progress. Progress occurs by removing the structural barriers to expressive autonomy and to political and economic equity. These barriers are intrinsically unjust, as are the customs that support them. It inherits, that is, this language inherits the Enlightenment's prejudice against prejudice, a pervasive suspicion of custom as unjustly constraining individual autonomy. Secularism comes easily to this language. Religion is not a public matter, but a private and individual preference. Expressive individualism is a natural fit with secularism and religious eclecticism. Conversely, possessive individualism tells a story of the triumph of commercial democracy over other types of regime. Commercial democracy is viewed as the natural form of civic association, and progress occurs by removing the artificial barriers that prevent its emergence. In this story, the common weal emerges spontaneously from the unfettered pursuit of individual interests. Hence, the readiness of people who speak this language to assume that democratic regimes will naturally emerge from the overthrow of despots, whatever the prior civic habits of a people. Religion in this language is a bulwark for the personal and domestic virtues important to commercial democracy. Possessive individualism fits naturally with civic and moralistic religion. Each dialect appeals to rights, but with different inflections. The rights language of expressive individualism is inflected toward expressive rights. These rest on a notion of personal dignity that has Christian roots, but probably stems more directly from Kant and Rousseau. On the other hand, the rights language of possessive individualism is inflected toward property rights and rights of association and speech. These rest on a notion of accrued value that has some Christian antecedents, but stems more directly from Locke. Each appeals to justice, but again with different inflections. Expressive individualism is inflected toward distributive justice, the obligations of the whole toward each and every member. The legitimate purpose of public power in this language is to protect the weak from the strong and to remedy inequities in the distribution of benefits. Those who reap an unjust reward owe a debt to society. Unjust takings call for social justice, which corrects inequities in the distribution of advantage and benefits. By contrast, possessive individualism is inflected toward reciprocal exchanges, commutative justice, which it treats as if they were all more or less made on an equal basis. Accordingly, the legitimate purpose of public power is to ensure public safety, property rights, and associational liberty. Those who disturb the public peace owe a debt to society, and injustice is made right by criminal justice, which punishes disturbers of the peace. Each appeals to a notion of individual autonomy that might be fairly described as nominalist, meaning only individuals properly exist. For the expressive individualist, autonomy means the unfettered right of each to define the meaning of her own existence. This language acknowledges structures and is even attentive to them, but generally only as encroachments on what is proper to individuals. Conversely, for the possessive individualist, autonomy means the entitlement of each individual to possess, enjoy, and use as she sees fit whatever she has earned, which is to say, whatever she has. In this language, structures take care of themselves if individual action is not artificially impeded. Each of these languages privileges some aspects of the human good, those it is well suited for articulating, while the aspects that it can express only ineptly or not at all remain obscure or even invisible. Thus, expressive individualism tends especially to pick out structural inequities, and those who speak it would use the power of the regulatory state and the judiciary to remedy them. The disvalues embedded in the actual social order tend to be more prominent in this language than the value of social order as such, while the cultural good of common meanings and values is nearly invisible. Its inflection, this language's inflection toward expressive rights, is biased against custom as heteronymous. that is, as imposing something artificial on you. Possessive individualism, on the other hand, is adept at noticing possessive and associational rights, but structural inequities are difficult to articulate for the possessive individualist, as are cultural goods like social trust, that are not easily reduced to individual and domestic virtue. Neither dialect of individualism is adequate to the full reality of the human good, as this reality must, or at least ought to appear in a Christian light. Moral monolinguism. Each of the moral languages we have sketched structures and carries a moral perspective that is or can be internally coherent. But as long as one inhabits only one's own native language, its role in structuring moral perception is likely to go unnoticed. Further, because both are dialects of individualism, they can be quite difficult to distinguish in practice. But because they are in fact different, what is perspicuous in one can be quite invisible to speakers of the other. Indeed, the discourse of the others is easily mistaken for a less fluent version of one's own. The languages are similar. Each appeals to fundamental values such as liberty, autonomy, rights, and justice. But these identical terms carry rather different meanings. The expressive individualist never means by autonomy, rights, or justice all that the possessive individualist hears, and vice versa. Hence, the speakers of each are likely to hear in the other only an incompetent utterance in its own. To work one's way into the coherence of the other would be to transcend the limitations of one's native common sense. But common sense is typically unaware that it has any important limitations to be transcended. I suspect that most Americans have some familiarity with both dialects, but also that their social experience will tend to privilege one or the other. In all likelihood, the more homogeneous one's social experience, the more readily and imperceptibly will the recessive dialect be assimilated to the paradigms of the dominant. Then it is all the easier to mistake its use by others for moral incompetence. On the other hand, and for similar reasons, it should be quite easy to move from one language to the other without adverting to the role the differences play in the development of one's moral perspective. Something like this probably happens to many students raised in an ambit of possessive individualism, but later immersed in the rather different expressive individualist homogeneity of most North American universities. Given our rather advanced state of civic decomposition and the challenges to communication presented by new media, functional literacy in both languages and at least an intimation of their differences and limitations may never have been so important. Regrettably, however, the trend seems to be toward functional monolinguism. We have become a nation divided by a common language, an inverse Babel, where everyone is confused by hearing others in her own language. What used to be our shared civic culture has deteriorated into an internecine strife. Survey data suggests that political polarization is at a post-war high. Not only have conservative and progressive views moved apart, but also there is an increasing tendency on both sides to attribute hostility or malice to the other. Why is this happening? There are doubtless numerous factors. We have lost a shared story of who we are, and this is both affecting and affected by the way our history is taught or not in schools across the country. It has probably contributed to and been abetted by the dismantling of university core curricula. Faculty can no longer agree about what shared questions or cultural resources an educated person ought to have examined. I suspect there are also new ways our social experience is being fragmented. A field of common experience keeps people in touch and is the first condition for the possibility of mutual understanding and common evaluations of the world. I do not suggest that American social experience ever was solidary, only that there are new, possibly relevant causes of its fragmentation. Post-war development patterns, incentivized, it should be noted, by government policy, have for decades been sorting Americans into quite different, homogeneous enclaves. But, and this is more recent, our media ecology has also been sorted into enclaves with a thoroughness never before seen. Social media have democratized the public square, but they have also split it sharply along two axes, vertical and horizontal. The middle is disappearing along both axes. Horizontally, separate media ecologies report different information through disparate lenses. Alternative interpretations are increasingly filtered out as a rule, so that the interpretations become less balanced and less chastened. Vertically, the blood sport version of commentary is in the ascendance. The intelligentsia has always been having a more sophisticated conversation than the many, but there was a moment in American life when middlebrow commentary took its cues from above, and that moment seems to be passing. Today, know-nothingism has captured the party of the right and also important segments of the left. Nuance is out, the race is to the bottom and to the extremes. These developments are not accidental possibilities that new technologies just happen to have realized. They are the unintended but predictable consequences of social media algorithms. The internet is not a neutral zone where the socially aberrant stumble upon one another. It is a breeding ground for social aberrants. Social media algorithms actively select for the idiosyncratic, the confirmatory, the emotionally charged, while screening out unpleasant information and perspectives. We are being systematically sifted. Neil Postman identified a technocracy as a culture that had lost its capacity for serious conversation about the value of its technologies. A dystopia like this is vividly presented in films like WALL-E or books like Brave New World. But what if our technology itself is directly and rapidly eroding the possibility of civil conversation, not only about technology, but about any matters of real importance? Section 4, for a Christian language. The question, so much, in other words, for the season of dysfunction. The question for us now is what kind of persons we are to be and to become, if we are to be a little leaven as Christians, as educators or educated persons, and as citizens in such a moment as this. We cannot we cannot expect to help others put on Christ except in the measure we have put on Christ ourselves. I do not have to tell you that nothing is more essential to that than prayer and devotion. I would say tender devotion, because I do not think fierceness is the need of the hour. We have had our fill of fierceness. Our Lord had no use for Peter's sword, but desired him to find and bind and feed and tend his errant lambs. Peter was afraid and denied the Lord. Why was he afraid? Because he did not understand what was happening. He could make sense of it only by resurrection eyes. Then he knew that victory could look and feel and taste like failure. I wonder if we know that. I wonder because the opposite is also true, that failure can look and feel and taste like victory. We are of no service to anyone unless we can tell the real difference. A properly Christian moral language is our capacity to notice and to name things in light of their true causes. It is our capacity to escape the shadows and images of the cave and see the sunlit world. Neither dialect of individualism is up to the job, but our discourse, our Christian discourse, is trapped in them, and we are confused. Not only are we talking past each other, we are also inept speakers of Christianity. Insofar as American discourse trades in a Christian idiom, it tends to debase the currency by assimilating Christian meanings and values to the meanings carried and the values admitted by possessive or expressive individualism. In all likelihood, and this is very important for us to face, we ourselves are doing the same. Imagining ourselves somehow exempt may be the worst thing we could do. These languages have invaded us. Learning Christ, then, is in a sense unlearning the world, that is, unlearning the dialects of individualism native to us as Americans. If, then, we would deliberately work our way into a more thoroughly and genuinely Christian moral language, the first order of business is conversion and repentance, and, we might add, a kind of intellectual and moral therapy. Here, then, I would like to draw attention to some topics on which our Christian discourse might be emancipated from the alternatives thrown up by the discourses of individualism. They are fact and fiction, benefit and harm, and good and evil. To know the difference between failure and victory, we must deepen our grip on the true problem of fact and fiction. The technocratic bias of our culture prepares us to think of the problem of fact and fiction as a matter of sifting out unreliable information. This is a real problem, of course, but it is hardly the basic problem. The basic problem is knowing the difference between true excellence and its appearance. Even Samuel was first deceived by the stately bearing of Eliab, Jesse's oldest son. In Plato's minor dialogue, Ion, the title character is a rhapsode, a performer, convinced that because he can deliver speeches of great generals more persuasively than they, he could in fact be a greater general than any of them. Ion, in other words, cannot distinguish reality from reality television, and neither can his fans. The counterfeit statesman is both deceiver and deceived, and so is his public. They, the public, mistake his projection for the reality of leadership. He mistakes their admiration for proof of his superiority. This is the dialectic of counterfeit rule. Next, we must know the difference between true and apparent principles of progress, power, decline, and redemption. The true principle of progress is self-transcending virtue. The true principle of power is cooperation. The true principle of decline is disorderly love of oneself. The true principle of redemption is self-giving love. But things seem otherwise according to the knowledge of the world. The apparent principle of progress is power. The apparent source of power is coercion. The apparent principle of decline is weakness. The apparent principle of recovery is getting power for our side and keeping it from the others. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. When we are deceived by the knowledge of the world, we become more afraid of the others than we are of becoming vicious ourselves. Under this deception, it becomes easy to imagine that power, even or perhaps especially if it is unscrupulous, is the precondition for protecting our values from the others who would destroy or thwart them. But really, it is the other way around. Virtue, self-transcendence, is the precondition for legitimate and good use of power. Virtue cannot be protected by unvirtuous power, but only suborned by it. This is a point on which I feel we must be absolutely convinced. Our bulwark against decline is not the coercive power of the state or the genius of the ruler, but only our capacity and that of our fellow citizens for self-transcendence and self-donation. When we are confused, we become afraid, and in our fear, we are tempted to despair, and despair puts its trust in princes. Then we harm ourselves still further by a constant flow of excuses which suborn conscience and increase blindness. We forget that the devil is a liar and the father of lies, and most of all, the little lies we tell ourselves. But we also harm our fellow citizens, and indeed everyone, not only by imposing unfit rulers upon them, but most of all by the scandal of our despair in the power of virtue to save itself. The calamity before us will not be staved off by any prince. The true calamity is the one we have brought upon ourselves. Our fear has blinded us, and we have lost confidence in the persuasive power of the gospel and the liberative power of God's saving love. For very many of our fellow citizens, and perhaps especially in the generation of our students, Christians are now and forever the people who thought it good and wise to entrust the American Republic to a model of depraved self-regard. This calamity illustrates the ineptitude of individualist moral languages. We have thought ourselves into a corner. St. Albert the Great complains of minds ruined by excessive devotion to universal principles and insufficient attention to concrete realities. It is not that the principles are invalid. They are as valid as they ever were. It is that universal principles are abstract, while the achievable good is always concrete. The whole problem for practical wisdom is to determine the achievable good. If abstract principles were sufficient to that problem, we Christians could have a written law. But we have no written law. Our law is the Spirit's gift of love. Its concrete illustration is the human and historical life of our Lord. It takes a certain measure of abstraction to pivot from the contemplation of Christ's life to the desire that the world's most powerful temporal office be occupied by a person whose more conspicuous qualities read like antitheses to St. Paul's list of the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. Pride and the lust for power build one thing only: Babylon, the city of exile and captivity. I have more on this theme, but I will skip it for the next. When we are more afraid of the others than we are of becoming vicious ourselves, we lose our proper grip on the true problem of good and evil. In the Dialectic of Delegitimation, each part blames the other. We easily imagine that we are the good and they are the bad. This is a form of Manichaeism, and it is quite dangerously misleading. It reinforces social division by sealing up heart against heart. The resentments of each tribe are confirmed by the felt hostility of the other. The excellence of the other is difficult to admit and pleasant to denigrate. Our own entanglements in sin are concealed from us, while the others are essentialized. Wrecked is the tenderness required to listen in the redemptive way that would make the best of others rather than the worst. If the others are evil and we are good, then they must be exposed, ridiculed, shouted down, excised, vanquished. Manichaeism is fratricidal. The true line between good and evil, as Solzhenitsyn put it, cuts through each and every human heart. If we are honest about the tares, the weeds in our own hearts, we may be able to appreciate the others as similarly entangled, trapped like we in the inadequate moral languages of American individualism, and in need of healing, not, except in the last resort, condemnation and excision. Of course, this is in no way to deny that we have an objectively absurd social situation marked by real injustice and oppression of various kinds. It is quite reasonable to be angry about these things, but while moral imperfection, especially the bias that prevents one seeing the injustice of one's own situation, is very common, true viciousness is rare. Pruning is altogether different from pulling up. Let me skip a little bit to the next and last section. Conversation as a praxis. How then shall we discharge our political responsibility as Christians in this winter of dysfunction? Perhaps it is already clear that it would be excessively narrow to think of this question merely in terms of how one ought to vote. What is badly needed in our republic is a functioning civil conversation. That, in turn, depends on social trust, not least in the possibility of personal and professional integrity. How we engage in political conversation constructively is the most important question of political responsibility for us. First, then, we must commit to practice a style of conversation that promotes understanding, repentance, and conversion, rather than conflict, division, and confusion. Because either of the dialects of modernity is capable of generating coherent moral conclusions, it will never be enough just to try to show people that they are wrong. The basic difficulty they have is not in the logic of their conclusions, but the insufficiency or the excessive narrowness of their assumptions. The truly valuable conversations are the ones that move toward a reframing of questions in a more articulate moral idiom. Inquiry and conversation are a form of ethical praxis. This seems to be Plato's point in his contrasting portraits of the eristic bombast of Thrasymachus, who just wants to win, and the dialectical honesty of Socrates and his friends, who are committed to getting things right. They knew that wonder is a form of radical self-surrender. There is a right way to inquire and a right way to converse. To articulate this right way, we have to discover in ourselves and encourage our students to discover in themselves the function of our different kinds of questions. For the basic norms of inquiry and so of meaningful conversation are intrinsic to the questions we ask for understanding, for evidence and judgment, for deliberation and choice. If Thomas Aquinas was right to say that the natural law is implanted in us as a created participation in uncreated light, then these norms will turn out to be the basic precepts of the natural law, which Bernard Lonergan formulated as be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible, and acknowledge your historicity, which is to say, among other things, acknowledge the likelihood that your received moral language is inadequate to the full reality of the human good. I have a little bit more I could say about that, but I will skip it for the moment to go to my last part. The virtues of inquiry and conversation, will be possessed fully when we have succeeded in habituating ourselves to the observance of these precepts in accordance with the mean, and in training ourselves to take pleasure and find joy not in winning arguments, but in getting things right in the company of friends. That, I think, is a sound template for what liberal education at its best can be. Among the spiritual works of mercy are to admonish the sinner and to instruct the ignorant. These are uncomfortable sayings, but I suggest their true importance for us in a time of civil confusion is perhaps inverse to their more obvious sense. That is, only one who is prepared to receive admonition and instruction for the kindness, or at least the benefit that it is, only one who is not resentful but grateful to discover her error, only that kind of person is capable of the spiritual works of mercy, because only such a one is capable of genuine conversation with joy and pleasure. Finally, we are to be ambassadors of reconciliation. One dimension of this embassy is to further Christ's deconstruction of the dividing wall in our polity. For this, our exercise of the virtues must be informed by the Spirit's gift of love. Justice is a rightness of order, but it is also a righting of disorder. In the righting of disorder, our Christian aim is not merely to restore equity, but to promote understanding, repentance, conversion, and reconciliation. The justice of a judge is impartial, but also impersonal. It defends victims and restores equity by compelling restitution, and in this way resembles the law of plunder, taking from some to give to others. Resentment will only be increased by the enforcement of this law against those who have never understood and have no wherewithal to understand their involvement in injustice. The justice of the cross is a higher justice, a personal and reconciling justice, a justice that seeks not punishment, but understanding, conversion, and willing restoration. I do not propose we aim for something less than the restoration of equity, but for something more, the restoration of civil comity, of friendship among citizens, of mutual understanding. The justice of the cross is not a prescription for ignoring injustice, but an invitation to the conversations, which will surely be difficult for everyone, that can go some way to restore not only objective equity, but also the tranquility of order. At the same time, we must be realistic, both about the limited value of retribution and about the difficulties of achieving equity in the face of historic injustices. Let me suggest an example. Rainier Harris is a black student at a prestigious high school in New York City. He describes some of his experiences of racism, including his classmates circulating his picture with the caption, "Monkey." The school's disciplinary policy had been to handle that kind of offense with expulsion. Predictably, that seemed disproportionate to the expelled students and to their friends and families, so that the general outcome was to increase rather than decrease racial tensions. But the school adopted a new policy of restorative rather than retributive justice. That involved Rainier, and in fact everyone in the school, in some quite difficult conversations. Because Rainier was able to sit down with his offender, the offender was able to understand his own actions in a new light. Rainier writes, quote, "Restorative justice doesn't allow an institution to simply remove the bad apples. It inspires solutions that achieve value and respect for everyone. It forces an institution to look at community-oriented solutions that make everybody uncomfortable, not just those who are involved. But it's the only way real change can be made. Let us go and do likewise." I'm well aware this is a delicate matter. For some, it will conjure up visions of Jacobin tribunals imposing re-education for offensive speech. That kind of thing can and does happen. It's not a contrivance of febrile imagination, and it does not generally conduce to understanding either. It is, coercion masquerading as persuasion. It is not an acceptance of the cross, but the imposition of the cross on others, and nothing could be further from my meaning. In any case, abuse does not invalidate use. And since we know that God works all things to the good, nothing ought to discourage us from the grateful and joyous performance of the embassy of reconciliation entrusted us by our Lord. I thank you very much for your kind attention. I'll be happy to take questions for as long as I can stand, or you can stand it.
There we go. Thank you, Dr. Wilkins. We've got a couple questions in the queue, so let's just dive right in. Maybe I'll begin with a sort of, I'm going to, for those of you who submitted them, take them a little out of order to impose some coherence on this, or at least progression. So you began by speaking about the sort of internal coherence of people's worldviews based on what sort of the polity they identify themselves or find themselves in. So I guess it's sort of a two-part question. How do we begin to test whether we're guilty of that internal? I know you say we are, but how would we become aware of it? What would be some practical ways we could begin to examine the parameters of that worldview? And what are we testing it against? So this internal coherence is shown to be inadequate when measured against what? Real coherence? Reality? Our neighbors? You're muted too.
Yeah, that's a great question. I take it that if we function very long in this country, or especially if we grew up in this country, then we've basically learned to think about things in the parameters that it gives us. And I think we ought to probably just take it that that's the case for us. What I suggested in the fourth part of the paper was some particular points of kind of renewing a Christian way of thinking about things, or a Christian language. But I find one of the things that you can do, and one of the things that I appreciate being able to do with students, is you read things that are significantly outside your outside the parameters of your kind of inherited horizon, and you can be quite confronted with worldviews that are quite different to your own, and that gives you an opportunity to begin to notice ways you're habitually thinking about certain kinds of problems and things that you're taking for granted. Obviously, as Christians, I have a predilection for Christian and certain kinds of classical sources that raise and examine these questions. It's become kind of it's kind of a weird, trendy thing to sort of dismiss the great books as dead white males or whatever. But I mean, I actually think when students read Plato or Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, it's the dead white males thing is a thing that really sort of starts with Locke or something. I mean, those authors are significantly outside their contemporary American moral horizon, and they have to work very hard to begin to figure out what's going on in the way the kinds of questions that those texts would raise to them. So that's one possible strategy. And just the other thing that I would say as a kind of a praxis matter is really start to practice. You could really start to practice trying to have the conversation where you're pleasantly surprised and not irritated to discover that you've been wrong about something, and really trying to have the conversation where you're not actually trying to win anything, but just really to examine questions. And I think that will probably also expose some of the ways in which we're conditioned to converse in a way that's oriented to trying to prove something to somebody else or to win or whatever.
Thank you very much for that answer. We have a couple questions here about this distinctively Christian language you spoke about. So I'll ask them one at a time. You spoke to a distinctly Christian language and a distinctively Christian way of thinking and conceiving. But given, as you also noted, that our very language and concepts are often co-opted, could you please speak to the difference between a positional account of the justice of the cross and the many counterpositional accounts that invoke retributive rather than restorative justice as a model for understanding Christ's anointing work? You've got some friends in the audience, clearly.
Yeah, that's a nice, rich theological question. Well, okay. I'm obliged to do a little historical narrative, I think, to do any justice of the question. So, the foundational work, in a way, for the way the problem gets articulated and comes down to us, is Anselm's why a God man, Credeus Homo. And Anselm basically says, look, there's two fundamental alternative ways in which sin is dealt with, and one is by retributive or vindictive justice, and the other is by what he calls satisfaction. And what satisfaction means is something like making amends, apologizing and trying to make amends. And so there's a whole context for this in Anselm's monastic world and the penitential life of the church that I won't go into. But there's two things that happen coming out of Anselm, for all you theologians who care about this, both of you. So the Anselm thing can go in a couple of different ways. So one is it can kind of go in the direction that Calvin takes it in, which is that the difference between retribution and satisfaction or amendment disappears. And so then it just becomes a case of God either imposes retribution on the sinner, or God visits the retribution on somebody else in place of the sinner, namely Christ. And so then you get at this kind of penal substitutionary model where instead of punishing the actually guilty person, God punishes an innocent person so that he can declare the guilty person innocent because the punishment has been fulfilled. And that, I think, is rather barbaric and probably also immoral. The other way that the Anselmian tradition goes is through Thomas Aquinas and Lonergan. And so there, the Anselmian distinction between retribution and voluntary amendment is not lost. And the idea of the voluntary amendment is integrated more carefully with an account of how God's gift of grace, the first gift of grace, is the love that touches the heart, that makes the possibility of change a real possibility for a person. And so then in that sort of account, Christ is not the substitutionary victim or scapegoat or whatever that's punished instead of the ones God is going to acquit, but Christ is rather something like the representative of their amendment, the one who can express adequately the necessary amendment, and by doing it, sort of bring his friends to understand the reality of their situation and the importance of them participating in some way in the amendment that he's making. So that's a sketch of what a positional account looks like, and a sketch of sort of how we get to the thing that actually is so common in a lot of preaching, which is, God is punishing Christ so that he can acquit you. And that's an idea with a history, and it's not an unproblematic idea. So, but I could say more about that, but it would probably be hazardous to the rest of the audience if I said too much more than that.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to tie together two questions from the same audience member. So thinking about them against your opening description of expressive and possessive moral languages, and tying that to the example of Rainier you gave at the end of the paper. How would we classify the moral work that language is doing the communication is doing in that interaction. Is it, the author asks, expressive without being individualistic, or how would we sort of speak about what's happening there?
You mean specifically in the Rainier kind of, I guess. So let me take it that that's what's meant.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I wasn't really part of those conversations. I mean, so I would be difficult for me to comment on exactly. You kind of need a bigger sample of the dialogue to sort of begin to suss out what might be going on. So I would just be guessing, but I mean, my guessing is that it's some version of expressive individualism becomes the medium of that conversation. It's the language that people more or less know if they're, particularly if they're educators in the United States. It's probably what they've been socialized into. It does have certain kinds of strengths. I mean, it is able to pick out problems of structural inequity and flag them as problems. So it does give you a language to address those kinds of issues. And so it's not, I think it has a lot of limitations, but it's not completely inept for the sort of limited purpose to which it would be needed to be put in a situation like the one Rainier described. And probably de facto is the way most of those things are happening.
Question along similar lines, but a different example. This question may reveal my entrenchment in my particular moral language, and if so, I will try to be pleasantly surprised by being shown to be in the wrong. Could start a friendly conversation. But I wonder whether this kind of approach to conversation with people, quote unquote, on the other side, is a dangerous move in a moment where so much is at stake. So do we have kind of time and space for this conversation in the next 3 weeks? To give an example, as someone living with a chronic illness who stands to lose much if the ACA is struck down, how can I go into conversation with someone who supports judges who would overturn it when I know their position can literally harm my life? I can't imagine going into such a conversation except with the aim to convince. Help me overcome my bias here if I'm missing something.
Well, I mean, the first thing is I'm definitely thinking about a longer time horizon than the next 3 weeks. We're in for very long ball, and there's a tremendous amount of unfortunate water that's under the bridge. But I think the thing is, we've gotten into a situation where we're just ready to assume that that all the people on the other side of the thing must somehow be either they're evil or that there isn't any way that a person could kind of construct a coherent moral perspective in which what they're doing could make some kind of sense. And I just really doubt that that's true. I mean, I think that most of the people on the other side of that question, that particular question, for example, I mean, I do think that there is a lot of self-deception that's involved in the kind of hand-wavy thing about the difference between the Merrick Garland moment and this moment. People know that they're being dishonest, and I think that that's a discredit to them. But it's also a measure of the extent to which we've all just sort of been sucked into this kind of zero-sum politics as a means of civil war. But I just doubt that it's true that most people on the other side of that are on the other side because they're bad. They're on the other side because they're concerned about something that they think is an important value. And I think it behooves all of us to sort of try and figure out, well, what are those? Are there values that in fact are important there that perhaps are somewhat invisible to ourselves? And, obviously I'm not, I understand there are all these pressing things, and there's always this sort of sense that one has to jump into the fray and do something now. But I think we're just in for a long ball, and we're not going to solve this problem by, kicking out the bad apples, so to speak. We got to actually figure out how to understand each other, and I think has to start with taking seriously the fact that most people are morally flawed, but not vicious, including me, I hope.
We have a question here about some of your concluding comments on repentance and conversion. So the author writes, you had a line about Christians, many of them anyway, now being known to parts of the country as the ones who handed over the country to the depraved. This identity could be damaging in the long run to Christianity, relegating it to the periphery, perhaps forever. But you mention that the new foundational language comes not from neologisms, but from repentance and conversion. Is there any sort of collective repentance and conversion that we could enact, or that the Christian community could engage in to make Christianity relevant and respectable? And what might that be?
Well, I left out a couple paragraphs on that problem. I mean, I think it's a calamity, but nothing could happen until the leaders recognize that there is a problem, that in fact they've been sucked into what in the paper I described as a worldly way of thinking about this, and that they have, I think, de facto despaired of the power of virtue to save itself, and decided that virtue, what they see as the necessary bulwark of virtue in the Republic, is going to have to be power, even if it's unscrupulous power. They're willing to play along with it. I had a friend, so I won't go into all that, but I would just say, look, I think that's a calamity. It's a calamity because, as the questioner suggests, Christians have discredited themselves in a way that I think is at least a generation. But it's not primarily a calamity because we've discredited ourselves. And if we think of it that way, right, we're still trapped in the discourse of the world. It's primarily a calamity because we've in fact suborned ourselves. We've permitted ourselves to make excuses for this and to despair of the power of virtue to save itself. And but until the leaders in the church recognize that that's what's happened, there's not going to be any. I mean, for just to give one example, and I won't call out any particular names, but the United States bishops, I mean, they're not all of the same mind on this, of course. And some will say, it's sort of clear from what they say that they're coming down on one side of the issue or another. But if you sort of read the way that the discussion is framed, it's framed in a way that issues like social trust and delegitimation and so forth, those kind of cultural goods, they're not really in view at all. And as long as they're not in view, there can't be any recognition that in fact we've sort of been sucked into this kind of debilitating discourse, and there will be no repentance until that happens, no collective, because there won't be any leadership on it. So I think we're in for a very long winter, but I mean, you still have to be grateful that God asked you to live at this time.
Sorry, you paused for a little too long, Jeremy. I got a number of great questions. Maybe I can forward them to you. I think we'll end with this one because we're right at about 9:30 here. And I think it ties together some of your suggestions nicely. You spoke of the need to unlearn the moral languages of possessive and expressive individualism, and the obligation or proposal to learn a Christian moral language that responds to the dysfunction of our early 21st century. Could you say more about what's involved in learning a new moral language and how such a spiritual exercise is connected to the reinvigoration of democratic practice?
Well, that's a great question. And as I was I was, I mean, I think, I think the first order of business obviously is recognizing the fact that you've internalized a language that basically has become your acquired spontaneity in terms of your thought patterns, and it's not sufficient. And so you have to, and so once you realize that, then you can be intentional about trying to work your way out of it. And I think the second thing, which I said at the beginning of that last section, is absolutely true, and that is there's too much of this business of making Christianity into some kind of set of universal moral principles that you can use to logic all your political problems or all your political decision making with, and not nearly enough of the thing that's just devotion to Christ and meditation upon him and his mysteries. And so, you know, if you're just dealing with abstract principles, you can justify all kinds of stuff. But when you're actually contemplating the mystery of our Lord, it becomes a little bit more difficult, it seems to me, to go in that sort of completely abstract way. But I think that you know, as far as the practicing of the conversational virtues, I have a paragraph in here which I omitted reading, where I think what Lonergan proposes as the practice of self-appropriation, which is attending to yourself in your inquiry, in your reflection and judgment, in your deliberation, a kind of a self-attention whose purpose is to help you make a decision about yourself, because you notice what the authentic dynamics of self-transcendence are, and you decide to try and stand by them. That's the purpose, and it's a kind of an ongoing asceticism. I think that could be extremely helpful for learning a new style of conversation. And of course, there's another way that it's sort of objectified in works like, you know, the Republic. I just always think Plato's got his thumb on something really big about this. And so, you know, those are sort of some suggestions. Obviously, Plato's not a Christian, but Plato is clear-eyed about the difference between the real problem of the true and the false, which is not informational, but it's a problem of discernment. That's the best probably I can do at 9:30 on Thursday night. But I'll give the question more thought, because I think there's probably a lot of other things that deserve to be said about it, and but I just haven't had time to think it through properly. So
I'm going to take advantage of my prerogative here to ask you one more question to broaden us back out, maybe especially for the students in the room. You spoke about wonder, which strikes me as delightfully bipartisan and transcendental. It's equally important for Christians and religious people of religious conviction, as it is for people of no religious conviction at all. And you spoke about this kind of wonder as a form of radical self-surrender. So how can, maybe thinking especially of our students in the audience, thinking about, we're in the middle of the semester, we're heading into the final stretch here, the work we're doing in the classroom, the work we're doing in our research, but also the work we're doing in our dorm rooms and our clubs, socially distanced and spaced as they are. How can that idea of wonder and self-surrender inform how we think about tough conversations with people who don't think like us, or authors who we don't seem to understand?
yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing is you recognize a possibility in yourself that that wonder establishes, and that is a possibility to be moved into something, which is a kind of self-surrender. I mean, if you're genuinely reading a book, it's posing questions to you. If you're genuinely having a conversation with another, the conversation is posing also questions to you. And I think people And so, you know, I mean, I think to notice in oneself the capacity to have that kind of openness and soft surrender and to care about other people. I always tell my students at the beginning of class, let's just pause for a moment and be grateful that we're here, that we have one another. The whole order of the universe conspired to put you together this year in this weirdest of all years. And these are the people that have been given to you. And I think it's easy to imagine how much nicer things would be in some alternate reality if I only had a nicer roommate or better classmates or better professors. But that's not the way that we actually grow. We actually grow by figuring out these are the ones that are sent to us, and we're going to grow by learning to love them and listen to them and care about what they have to say to us and recognize that in fact they will have something to say to us, just as we'll have something to say to them. You can get lost, I think, by dreaming about people who didn't come your way and forgetting to love the people who did come your way. So I think I would focus on that and wonder as a capacity to be transparent to them, to let them be transparent to you. Anyway, that's kind of a fervorino, and maybe you wanted something different from that, but it's I think the most important thing to be said. And I always say to people, by the way, the most important thing that I ever have to say to any audience is you can pray, you know. And you might be amazed. So I just leave it at that size. But be grateful too. That's part of it.
All right, that brings our evening to a close. Thank you all for joining us. I hope it was insightful and illuminative. If you have ideas about people you would like to bring to campus speaking about this or other kinds of issues in conversation with the Catholic intellectual tradition, we would love to have your suggestions. And that's it for tonight. Thank you all for being here. Take care.